There's an assumption that some people, especially our leaders, put forward these ideas that poor people just don't work hard enough and that's why they're poor, that they actually believe it. And I'm wondering whether, you think that is true or whether this is kind of just a bit of a convenient narrative that's wheeled out by people who don't believe in helping other people, in paying for welfare and their money going towards welfare.
Do you know what? I honestly think they believe it, but not because they're trying to play political games necessarily. They believe it because unless you're really dedicated to trying to understand your fellow human, if you haven't come from that kind of background, even if you were kind of working class, right? Working class is tough and it's got its own cultural kind of access issues, no matter where you live kind of thing. But if you haven't known real destitution and that kind of hand-to-mouth fighting and battling every hour, wondering how you're going to pay these bills, how you're going to do X, Y, Z, you actually don't really understand the fact that they work harder than anyone else by dint of just trying to survive. And that kind of motto, they look at people and they think, well, I'm a success. I wasn't fabulously wealthy. There's this great study, and I think I mentioned it in that book, but I can't remember where it came from. But basically every income quintile in Australia, they all think they're poorer than they actually are, except for the poorest people at the bottom who actually think they're better off than they really are. And I think that says so much about our psyche, right? And it's interesting. I just wanted to make this point as well, because we're all here now talking about the myth of the fair go via the Sydney Opera House platform. And people will look at us and be like, well, obviously it's true. These people made it. And my point that I'm making that on Money essay is that you can't fall for the fallacy of the one who made it out. I didn't get here because I worked harder or smarter. I got here mostly by pure silly luck, and that I met the right adults at the right point in time across my life who were there to support me in a million different ways that I needed to.
And it's such an intoxicating narrative that I think, like, as a junior journalist, a lot of you buy into when you're doing those stories. Here's this person, they made it. This is a fair country. I've seen so many of those stories.
It's a great story.
Sheila, I know your family has an incredible story with your parents actually meeting while fleeing South Vietnam. I'm wondering how their experiences and ideas shape your view of Australian society and shaped it growing up. What you expected because of their experiences.
Yeah, I was really interested in what Rick described about his mother protecting him from the reality, whereas I would say I grew up with the exact opposite idea of the myth of the fair go, in that I was told that life was actually incredibly unfair and that everything in our life actually pointed to this. Even though my dad would always say how lucky we were to be in Australia, he wasn't exactly a grateful refugee, I would say. He certainly had his issues with Australia, and we certainly didn't necessarily aspire to be like everyone else. But I guess when Rick talks about that poverty and that, it's something that my family experienced as well. Obviously my parents came to Australia as resettled refugees. They left, the classic story, they left on a boat, they ended up in a refugee camp. They turned up in Adelaide with nothing, basically. But when I look back at my parents' life, it is incredible the financial risk they took as well. We were heavily indebted for a long time, but even after being in Australia for about 8 years, they took out a huge loan to start up a supermarket, and then it failed after 2 years, and then we were just paying off that debt for the next 15 years. So I think all of those experiences early on, and compounded with, I would say, a lot of trauma in the family background too. As a child, I wasn't really protected from how difficult our life was. I witnessed a lot of violence and alcoholism, you name it, just very dysfunctional adult behavior. But I think because of that, I was told that, it was really important to be educated, and that this was a transition, that we weren't supposed to stay in this sort of phase of life, that we were supposed to do better from the next generation. So I think a lot of people from backgrounds like me, would find that a common experience where you're really burdened with the success of every generation that has come before you, all of their sacrifices are propelling you to really do your best, especially with education in the Vietnamese context. There's a real kind of focus on education being a pathway out of poverty, and I guess in terms of class mobility as well.
A lot of people think, and I've had this conversation with friends of mine that are religious, that religion, they think that morals come from religion, right? They think that even if you de-link religion from politics and society, you're still keeping the bits that you like, which is a set of moral values. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I think, morals predate religion, and there's lots of societies that aren't deeply religious or Abrahamic in terms of their religion that have moral positions. But either way, I don't think if you lose religion or you lose Christianity from Australian society or Australian politics, you get some sort of moral vacuum. But I think you get probably a different set of morals. And I think the challenge we have...
Maybe a less racist set of morals?
Yeah, totally. And I think the challenge we have in Australia, and it speaks to this issue of morals that you're asking about, but also on a whole bunch of issues, which is that our political class are so disconnected in just a representational sense from what this country looks like, that you don't even need to wait for the next census results to demonstrate that Christianity is smaller as a proportion of the population than it is now. The kinds of people in Parliament, in terms of their age, their race, their gender, their religious background, all of those things shape their moral positions, are vastly out of step with where this country is at. And so when it comes to questions of trust, when it comes to questions of a shared vision, I think that disconnect is partly why there is so much cynicism and angst about the Australian political system right now. I think it's just going to get worse. I don't see it changing. I mean, when I say I see it getting worse, as if things continue on their current trajectory, I see it getting worse. I'm not some sort of doom, I'm a very cynical person, but I don't think it's inevitable that things get worse. But I do think that mainstream politics needs a significant reset to have people there. I think about people, younger generation of people that in my sort of social groups and in my family social groups who maybe aren't religious but still are driven by a moral sense of purpose and what they think about is right and wrong. The more of those people we have who look like the country, that can make arguments in the same kinds of terms as normal Australians do, that may go some way in building what is a genuine shared vision of Australia. And if you have a genuine shared vision, then when you make moral appeals, you actually bring people along because they get what you're talking about.
The thing they couldn't prepare for was the same thing that we won't prepare for, because in their case, they didn't know about it. And because in our case, the political system can't listen to it. And that is that the climate system has much greater things in store for us than we think. Do you think that the public understands?
Yeah, if you talk to paleo, there's a whole field now called paleoclimatology, where people study the climates of the past, and more we see these episodes where there were just natural climate changes for complicated reasons. Sometimes we don't even know the reasons, but average global temperatures maybe, or not even average, regional temperatures might have dropped or risen by 1 degree, something that we're going to blow past, no problem. Or you got a very serious and those were accompanied often it seems the changes that were really quite destabilizing were droughts. How do you deal with having no water? How do you deal with not being able to grow the crops that you were accustomed to growing? And so that particular civilization, whose demise has been linked to drought, Akkad, the kingdom of Akkad, as you say, that roughly 4,000 years or so. There are this. I also quote in that book this poem that sort of survives from that time, and it's actually incredibly bleak and incredibly modern sounding and incredibly moving. People talking about what happened here.
Australia, of course, is home to one of the world's oldest continuing civilizations, going back 60,000 years. There was a fantastic book called Sand Talk by a Deakin University academic, Tyson Yunkaporta, that talks about how stories, preserved by Aboriginal cultures talk about the last ice melt when there was, a land bridge to PNG. What do you think we can learn from the survival and continuity of Aboriginal culture in Australia about surviving climate instability?
Well, I think that's a really good question, a really interesting question, because of course, humanity, Homo sapiens as a species, we've been around, let's say roughly 300,000 years. So we made it through, 2 ice ages, and a lot, as you say, a lot of climatic changes. So through the ice age and then through the transition out of the ice age.
Look, wherever I see, I turn my eyes to, I see hope. In the midst of all the bleakness, youngsters in particular, they, not just Extinction Rebellion youngsters, them as well, the complete turnaround of the sentiment that we labored under in the 1990s. For me, Scott, the 1990s was awful. Because in the 1990s, we had this false sense of having arrived the end of history. Everything was just about entrepreneurship, about competitiveness. We were a global village. Everybody, capitalism was working. Nobody was talking about the environment except for the greenies. And in other words, never before has humanity been so disconnected from its own reality as it was in the 1990s. Today, we have exactly the opposite. When you talk to youngsters, when you talk to school children, students, workers, Uber drivers, everybody has a sense that things must change. And also that things can change. All that is needed is a program. This is my only criticism of Extinction Rebellion. It's not their job to do it. It's our job to do it. Us oldies have to provide the program. Because it's one thing to rebel. It's essential. But then when some, ABC journalist or BBC journalist or whatever, or Fox TV journalist shoves a microphone in your face and says, okay, so you don't like what's happening. What do you want to happen? How are you going to pay for the green transition? There, you need a program. Because if you don't have an answer to that, your movement fizzles out. This is where the Progressive International, Extinction Rebellion, and so on need to go hand in hand.
In the future world in which you envisage and which millions of people around the world are busy working on, is there a place for nuclear weapons?
No. There's no place for nuclear energy either, in my view.
Wonderful.
And let me tell you why. Oh, that was enough for you? Okay, nuclear weapons.
I'm already on board,
why
though.
would we want to have weapons that destroy the planet? I mean, we're doing a very good job destroying the planet without nuclear weapons, but why do we want to do it so quickly?